I just finished doing a brake job on my 2011 Ford Fusion. It's still the dirty work that it's always been, but over the last few decades there's been a lot of changes on do-it-yourself brake work, and that's what this video tries to address. The first one of these changes is the use of a C-clamp to push back the piston and the caliper. That doesn't really cut it anymore, on the, especially on the rear wheels, with the integration of the parking brake to the caliper. The new term is you have to rewind the caliper. The piston has to rotate as it's pushed back in. Special tooling is kind of the best way to go with that. I went with this kit that I got on Amazon. It's only $30. It's got to be one of the best automotive tool buys around. Quality build, lots of hardware here for the money. And it works great. So I was able to rewind the piston in my Ford Fusion on the rear wheels. You could use the C-clamp on the front in the traditional fashion, but why would you? Once you've got this tool, it also goes quite well for the standard front caliper brakes. Okay, so now you got a fancy tool. You'd think it'd be a nice straightforward job of just pushing the piston back into the caliper. With ABS modules, it's not that straightforward. The ABS module does not like reverse flow, and in particular doesn't like dirty brake fluid reverse flowed. And the dirtiest of all brake fluid is right here at the caliper. There are some suggestions that the proper way to do that is to put a pair of pliers on the brake line and squeeze it shut while you open the brake bleeder, and as you push the piston back in, that dirty brake fluid would go into a container. I don't like the idea of putting a pair of pliers and crimping the hose, and I don't really like having too many things to handle here. The brake tool, the caliper in my hands, a jar and a hose on the bleeder. It's a recipe for making a mess. So I've come up with a procedure to address those concerns. I do a preliminary brake fluid flush on all four wheels. I flush out a lot of brake fluid so that when I do push the pistons back in, I'm not sending dirty fluid back up. And so as not to dismiss also the concerns of any reverse flow, clean brake fluid or not through the ABS module, I do it very gently. So I could probably rewind the piston back in with this tool nice and quick. I just take my time a little bit, give it time, push it back in slowly and let the brake fluid go back. All data doesn't make any mention of taking any precautions with reverse flow at all. So we can afford to be generous with the brake fluid flush. Brake fluid is sold by the liter, and once you break open the seal in the container, you can't store the material. So you may as well consume all or most of it when you're doing this work. Here's another kicker, something that has changed over the years. It used to be that you could count on always doing a brake bleed by starting at the farthest wheel from the master cylinder and working your way up to the closest wheel to the master cylinder. On this vehicle that still remains the same, but there are a number of manufacturers where they will state a different sequence to bleeding the lines. A good rule of thumb to follow for that is that the further the ABS module is situated to the rear of the master cylinder, the greater the chance that the manufacturer will have a specialized sequence for which wheels to bleed first. The two-man brake bleeding method, where you got a buddy on the brake pedal and you're at the bleeder valve and you're trying to coordinate, is probably the best in being able to tell you when there are no more air bubbles coming through that plastic line. But it's awful for the master cylinder. In normal operation, when you use your brakes, the piston only travels in the front portion of that master cylinder. And behind it, there's a lot of crap that builds up. When you do a brake bleed, you're opening the bleeder valve, and that allows your buddy to push the brake pedal much further, and the piston will advance into that dirty part of the master cylinder, and the cup will get damaged. So after a brake job, the first thing you know, shortly thereafter, you've got a master cylinder problem. So I've adopted the vacuum method. And I've used this particular style that requires a fairly decent air compressor to run, like at least a 2 horsepower air compressor. If you don't have that, they have the smaller handheld vacuum pumps. You're going to do a lot of hand pumping with that. And remember, we're going to be going through about 1 liter of brake fluid. So that little jar that comes with those will have to be emptied quite frequently. But if that's all you got, I prefer this. It's got a much larger container. Now, the problem with the vacuum bleeding is that you'll never get the air bubbles out of that clear plastic line as an indicator that all the air is out of your brake system. You can put grease on the threads, as some suggest, on the bleeder valve. There's always going to be air bubbles there. Not to worry about that. I'm convinced that from the brake fluid reservoir down through the master cylinder, through the ABS module, down to the brake caliper and all your brake lines is at one stage brake fluid that has no air in it. Once you start getting all of the dark old fluid out and you see clean, clear fluid coming through, I think that any air that comes in is through the suction and it's happening outside of the brake caliper, and I wouldn't worry about it. And the true test of it all is when the job is all done, is the brake pedal is firm. That's what we're trying to achieve. You'll recall that I start this brake work with a preliminary brake bleed on all 4 wheels. Once the brake pads are installed, I depress the brake pedal a few times to refill whatever the pistons have to move to tighten up. And then I do a final brake bleed on all 4 wheels. In the old days, if you would have told somebody, have you greased your brakes? It would have been like a running joke, something similar to what today if you said, have you checked the headlight fluid? But lubricating your brakes is a very important part of the job today. You get brake squeal, and the tendency is to think that the squealing comes from the contact of the brake pad material against the rotor. And it's actually coming from the back face of the brake pads where they make contact to the piston and the ears of the caliper. So they make brake lubricant for that. Permatex has this brake lubricant. It's orange in color, very pasty. I kind of like it. You butter up the shims and the back faces of the brake pads with this product. But the guide pins themselves that are here, they need a special lubricant. It's got to be a non-petroleum based grease. Napa makes a product called Silglide. We don't have a Napa store nearby, so I use this Permatex synthetic grease with PTFE. It's a non-petroleum based grease. The reason to use something silicone based like that on those pins is that there's a rubber component on the back half of the pin, and you don't want that rubber to swell because those pins won't work properly anymore. So you got to be really careful with those. Never Seize is great for the threads on the mounting bolts, but it's not meant to do the work on the shims or the back of the brake pads. Use a proper product for all of that. So it's still a dirty job like it always was, but it's not the same job today as it used to be. It's a lot more intricate, and you got to use these specialty products, maybe some of the specialty tools, and you know, it's old school meets new school. As a do-it-yourself mechanic, you got to be able to adapt. You guys take care.